Okay, let me go to Sean O'Grady and talk about some of the motives or reasons behind these attacks. Sean, there appears to be a vigorous debate that's taking place in the United Kingdom now on the connection between these attacks and British foreign policy, particularly its policy, of course, towards the Middle East, its involvement in the wars in the Middle East there. Do you see a connection?
There is some connection. I think it's very obvious because we didn't have Islamist violence in Britain or Europe or even America for that matter before about the 1990s. And part of it does stem from the Israeli-Palestine question. It stems from what's gone on in the Gulf. It stems from our policies in Iraq and Syria and Libya and other countries. These are all factors that have, in different ways, fostered it. Some of it is money coming over from certain Gulf states or entities that fund extremist preachers and educational materials, so-called literature in mosques and madrasas. Some of it is just resentment, a feeling that it's a war against Muslims. The way in which you fight this is you don't fight it with armaments, you don't even fight it with intelligence, although those things are needed and we have to have the resources to do that. What you have to do is win the argument, and you win the argument in forums like this, through the media, through social media, through face-to-face conversations, through religious groups, through civil groups, the whole gamut. And that's what you do. And you say to these people, this is why you're using Islam, or you're being taught this version of Islam, which you think is right and you're sincere about it, but this is why you're wrong. This is why the things that you're doing are wrong and evil. And you know, you can't be expected to be supported for it. That's what you have to do. You have to make them understand not only the consequences of it, which they're not terribly frightened of, because it's a new thing to be a suicide bomber and to actually, you know, embrace the idea of a glorious death or something. You have to prove to them why they shouldn't be doing it in the first place. That's the challenge. You have to say to them, Western governments have been intervening in places like Bosnia to save Muslims' lives. You have to make the argument that these Muslims are killing other Muslims. It may be that, well, I know for a fact that some of the institutions, some of the restaurants and so on in Borough Market in South London, which was the part of the London Bridge attack, are owned and run by Muslim people. You know, those are the sorts of arguments that we need to make. Yeah. When they bombed London in 2005, they killed Muslim people. This is what they need to understand. And that's really the way in which you go at it. It's not something that's going to be solved by changing the laws, by going after the Google and Facebook. It's not even going to be done if you crack Telegram and these closed-end encrypted services and so on. You have to win the minds of these people, or their hearts, or their spirit. That's what you have to win.
Yeah, let me get Mohammed's view on this. Mohammed, is this a battle for hearts and minds here? One has to persuade young people who've become disaffected in their adopted countries to change, and that they need to change their way. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Sean's absolutely right. We've got to win hearts and minds, and one key component is taking on the ideology. So when they distort Islamic teachings to justify their violent methods, we have to have a counter-narrative. So there are a number of Islamic scholars across the world. There's Sheikh Dr. Tariq Qadri from Pakistan, who's wrote a 600-page edict against terrorism. There's Sheikh Yaqoubi from Syria, who's done the same. And in the United States, you've got Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, a well-known Islamic scholar who has put together an alternative counter-narrative to what the terrorists claim. So that's, I think, really important. And the people in the Muslim community, we've got to be at the forefront of that and lead on that. There is an issue around foreign policy. So let's just take Libya, for example, where the Manchester bomber was from. We bombed Libya, and then we left. And then ISIS was on the rise in that country. We look at the Iraq war. Britain did not suffer from any terrorist attack before the invasion of Iraq. And young people tell me time and time again in the conversations I'm having here in the community across this country is foreign policy is one of the issues. And what's been really sad is government ministers here and commentators in the media suddenly suggest, as soon as you talk about foreign policy, that somehow you're an apologist. We are selling billions of pounds of arms to Gulf countries who are then using that to massacre people in Yemen. Yet our government is refusing to address that issue. So I think there's a holistic approach to these issues. Deal with the ideology, deal with the issues of foreign policy. And yes, we've got to come together as a community. That's why I'm proud here in Manchester, when the terrorist attack happened, it was the Muslim taxi drivers that were dropping off for people for free. It was the takeaway workers, it was the restaurants, in the bars, who all came together. And you saw the best of Manchester. And I think that's a method, that's a real way in other cities around the world can come together and defeat this. This affects all communities, and they're enemies of my faith, Islam, and we rest until we defeat them.
Jalal, do we know what motivates young people, young men especially, to become radicalized and then be persuaded to carry out these kinds of horrendous attacks? Is there a political motive on the part of the people who organize these things to say we are going to attack these Western countries until they stop attacking us? Or is there more to it? Is it a big ideological, religious battle that we're seeing?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I think it's very important to keep in mind that the latest wave of attacks is not exclusive to Europe. I think it's always instructive to also keep an eye on North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria, and usually you have a correlation. What I'm trying to say is that anything that resembles a state structure, anything that resembles an institution that is not theirs, is going to be attacked. And I think the reason Europe is being affected as opposed to the US is really about geography. It's a proximity to the largest humanitarian disaster since World War II, namely Syria. The fact that Syria is so close to Europe is one of the primary reasons. And I also wanted to react to the word that Sean used, the word argument. And I think it strikes me as a little bit too rational, too structured. I think in the 90s you had opportunities to use the word argument, because if you looked at the demands from terrorists, it was about the Palestinian cause, and it was about making sure that the U.S. troops leave the Arabian Peninsula during between the two Gulf Wars. You had cogent demands. And I think what is happening, and that's a trend that is quite obvious, is that the demands are more and more vague and more emotional. So it's really about pure emotion in the heart of a young kid. And what happens there, I don't think there's any consensus at this stage. But what I'm trying to say, it's really about opportunity offered by what some people call a target-rich environment like Europe. You have many opportunities, and I think this group is going to use all opportunities available to them. And at the same time, it's always good to keep in mind that Europe is not the only one affected. It's really part of a wider wave, really.
Right. Aykan, here's one argument that I've read about. This was from a commentator in the British newspaper, The Guardian, and she said that it was never the intention of ISIS to carry out these types of attacks on European cities. But as the European and American coalition started attacking their caliphate in the Middle East, started dismantling that caliphate, that's when they started attacking these cities. Does that make sense to you?
Now, there are two sides to the argument. On the one hand, I would like to argue that no matter what the West does, these types of attacks would happen. I think the West should not exaggerate its own role in these things, because that sectarian, extremist, violent tradition has been there in the Islamic world long before colonialism. When we take a look at early Islamic history, we've seen bloody sectarian attacks, people killing one another, right from the first period of the four right.
But we had that all over the world, didn't we?
Yes, all over the world. Yeah. So it's not just about the West. It's not just about response to the West. The second is
Islam and Muslims are not the same.
Yes, what's happening with the fall of Mosul, and then maybe with the fall of Raqqa, is that jihadis will be looking for new theaters of action.
Okay.
We are seeing people moving back to their countries of origin, so this will exacerbate the problem. But ultimately, I would argue that, let's assume the West completely disengages. Left on its own, in the Islamic world, we will continue to see violence. We will continue to see sectarian clashes. We will continue to see groups trying to dominate others. Because if we just boil this down to the kind of the clash of Islam with Christianity, we would miss this authoritarian, patriarchal, homophobic tendency, misogynist tendency in the Islamic world.
Yeah, Mohammed, you wanted to say something?
Well, I mean, I really struggle with that sort of comment. You know, yes, there is a struggle here, and the struggle is to take on the terrorist. That's what we've got to focus on. And the Muslim world, the Christian world, the Jewish world, people of no faith, we all need to come together and defeat that ideology. And you're right, it is something which concerns many people. But I think the idea that somehow inherently Muslim countries and Muslim societies have been inherently violent is blatantly not true. You know, you could argue over centuries the Christians in Europe, you know, spent generations killing one another. Right. So let's not focus on that. Let's focus on how we can stop this threat and stop this threat from terrorism now.
Okay, Sean, I've got a question here for you, and I've only got about 40 seconds. Britain's got a general election coming up on Thursday. How are these attacks going to affect the outcome of that election?
Well, very strangely, because what you would expect to happen is people tend to rally behind the government, and the Conservatives usually do well on security issues. What's happened here is that people are tending to criticise or even blame Theresa May, who's Prime Minister and was the Home Secretary before, for cutting the number of police that we had in this country, and that is one of the things that people say may have contributed to what happened in recent months.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's at facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.